September 1943 at Rabel Airfield saw a thick, humid atmosphere tinged with volcanic dust and the faint scent of aviation fuel. Inside an operations tent, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, a living legend and samurai of the skies, his left eye a milky white void from an American Dauntless dive bomber's tail gunner, scanned an intelligence report with his good eye, which had guided him to over 60 aerial victories. Suddenly, a deep, genuine, dismissive laugh cut through the oppressive heat. Sakai read the report's contents aloud to the elite pilots of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service. The Americans had a new fighter, the Hellcat, a name Sakai found absurd, mere brutish American marketing. But the specifications were truly comical. The intelligence reports indicated the new American fighter weighed nearly 6 tons, twice the heft of the nimble Mitsubishi A6M0. Laughter echoed through the tent as the pilots, artists of aerial combat, contemplated this lumbering machine challenging their swift, responsive aircraft. For 2 years, the Zero had reigned supreme in the Pacific, a scalpel-like whisper on the wind outmaneuvering any Allied fighter. Now the Americans sought to counter this aerial dominance with a heavy, clumsy sledgehammer. Peering through the tent flaps, Sakai admired his squadron's Zeros, beautiful, sleek, and lethally agile. These aircraft had swept the skies clear of British Hurricanes, American P-40s, and Dutch Brewster Buffaloes. They embodied a warrior philosophy prioritizing skill, spirit, and nimble responsiveness over brute force. To these pilots, the notion of the Americans fielding such a ponderous fighter was the height of absurdity. This new American fighter, the Hellcat, drew scorn from the pilots. It appeared an ungainly, overbuilt machine, a continuation of the failed U.S. design philosophy of solving problems through sheer material excess. The consensus in the tent was clear. The Hellcat would prove an easy target, a mere footnote in the glorious history of the Japanese Zero. Yet what Saburo Sakai and the other pilots laughing that day could not foresee was that this joke of an aircraft, this ugly, overweight American plane, represented not just a new plane, but a death sentence. It embodied an industrial and tactical philosophy so powerful, so ruthless, that it would not merely defeat the Zero, but systematically annihilate Japanese naval aviation. In under 2 years, this failure of design would account for over 5,000 Japanese aircraft kills, achieving an astonishing 19-to-1 kill ratio. The laughter in that tent marked the last echo of a bygone era. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had long dominated Pacific skies, its unparalleled agility rewriting the rules of aerial combat. Yet the era of this legendary fighter was about to end, supplanted by a new breed of warplane, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat's arrival would usher in a dramatic shift, transforming the Pacific theater from a dueling ground into a slaughterhouse for the once invincible Zero. To grasp the sheer impact of the Hellcat, one must first understand the myth surrounding the Zero. In the war's early years, the Zero appeared as a ghostly silver phantom, defying the known limits of aeronautics. Allied pilots who survived encounters with this nimble fighter spoke in hushed, disbelieving tones. They described a plane that could climb like a rocket and turn on a dime, easily outmaneuvering their own sluggish aircraft. The Zero's dominance had been absolute, but the tide was about to turn. The Hellcat's arrival would rewrite the mathematics of airpower in the Pacific, ushering in a new era of aerial warfare. The once fearsome Zero would soon find itself outmatched and outclassed, its legend fading as the Hellcat's reign of fury began. The lopsided statistics seemed almost propagandistic. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese lost a mere 29 aircraft while destroying or disabling over 300 American planes. In the conquest of the Philippines, the ratio was 7 losses against 103 destroyed. This pattern repeated across theaters. The Zero fighter proved unassailable. When American engineers finally examined a captured Zero in 1942, the Akuten Zero, they were initially incredulous. Their performance analysis revealed a fighter with the range of a light bomber, the agility of a pre-war biplane, and the firepower to overwhelm any adversary. This seeming impossibility stemmed from the design philosophy of the Zero's creator, Jiro Hiroshi. Tasked with developing a carrier-based fighter surpassing any land-based counterpart in speed, maneuverability, and range, Hiroshi had achieved a brilliant yet brutal solution. The Zero's design philosophy centered on uncompromising performance. Its airframe consisted of a top-secret aluminum alloy, dubbed extra super duralumin, which achieved remarkable strength and lightness. However, this came at a cost. Pilot protection was sacrificed, with no armor plating to shield against enemy fire. Fuel tanks lacked self-sealing capabilities, leaving the aircraft vulnerable to ignition from stray rounds. Even the radio was often removed to shave off precious pounds. Every component underwent rigorous scrutiny, and anything deemed non-essential for flight or combat was discarded. The result was a masterpiece of minimalist engineering. The wing loading, at just 22 pounds per square foot, endowed the Zero with an exceptional turning radius of just over 600 feet. The Japanese Naval Air Service championed the supremacy of the pilot, the samurai spirit elevated by an aircraft that was a pure extension of the aviator's will. They viewed air combat as an art form, a duel of skill. In their artists' hands, the nimble Zero fighter was the perfect brush. So when the first intelligence on the Grumman F6F Hellcat emerged in early 1943, it was met with utter contempt. The Hellcat's specifications read like a catalog of everything a fighter plane should not be. The Zero responded to thought, not just control inputs. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's future ace of aces, described flying it as, like wearing wings. In contrast, American planes flew, like trucks, powerful but clumsy. The Japanese believed their fighters were built with the precision of an artisan, while the Hellcat's design seemed heavy, overbuilt, and wasteful, constructed more like mass-produced automobiles than precision instruments of aerial warfare. The Hellcat's formidable weight, exceeding 12,000 pounds, contrasted sharply with the nimble Zero's mere 5,800 pounds. Its wing loading of 36.5 pounds per square foot suggested a turning radius approaching 1,000 feet. A liability in the tight maneuvers Japanese pilots had mastered. Armor plating, bulletproof glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks added hundreds of pounds, transforming the Hellcat into a ponderous, heavily armed fighter, the antithesis of the Zero's sleek design. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor assault, dismissed the American aircraft, concluding that they had learned nothing. The Hellcat represented a continuation of the failed philosophy of prioritizing machine power over pilot skill. Its design seemed to confirm the mathematical superiority of the nimble Zero fighter. The entire Japanese tactical doctrine revolved around the turning dogfight, where the Zero's agility would allow it to get on an enemy's tail and finish the kill. By the numbers, the Hellcat was engineered to lose this aerial dance every time. Japanese pilots thus viewed the Hellcat not as a threat, but as validation of their own aerial mastery. They saw themselves as the artistic, samurai-like warriors, while the Americans were merely factory workers churning out clumsy, soulless iron beasts. The war's true nature was about to reveal itself in the most brutal manner imaginable. The Americans had not come to duel, but to exterminate. The first hint of this catastrophic misunderstanding emerged on September 30, 1943 near Marcus Island. Veteran Zero pilot Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was escorting a reconnaissance plane, intimately familiar with the sky's rhythms and dangers. When he spotted 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast, his seasoned instincts initially identified them as B-25 bombers on an unusual route, their size and bulk clearly distinguishing them from fighters. But as the shapes turned, Fukui recognized the unmistakable silhouette. The Americans' arrival signaled a fundamental shift in the conflict's dynamics. No longer was this a duel between adversaries, it had become a campaign of annihilation. Fukui and his compatriots were about to confront this horrifying reality head-on. A massive radial engine dominated the aircraft's barrel-chested fuselage, while its wings appeared comically short and stubby for such a large body. Fukulele's first encounter with the F6F fighter left him unimpressed, noting it resembled a torpedo bomber with fighter guns mounted on it. An ugly, brutish-looking thing. Yet the Japanese pilot felt no fear, only professional curiosity. He and his wingman planned to employ the time-honored tactics that had never failed them before. Fukaleli rolled his Zero into a diving turn, the standard opening move. The plan was straightforward. Leverage the Zero's exquisite agility to slice inside the clumsy American fighter's turn, get on its tail, and send it burning into the Pacific. Expecting the heavy American aircraft to continue straight, unable to match his nimble maneuver, Fukaleli anticipated curving neatly onto its 6 o'clock position. A position from which no Allied pilot had ever escaped him. The impossible unfolded before Fukui's eyes. Defying the conventions of aerial combat, the Hellcat refused to turn with him. Instead, it executed a vertical climb, a maneuver that violated every tenet Fukui had learned. Stunned, he watched as the Hellcat's nose pointed skyward, surging upwards with a ferocious, terrifying power he had never witnessed. The source of this capability lay in the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a marvel of 18-cylinder engineering producing over 2,000 horsepower. This figure dwarfed the 700 horsepower output of the Zero's Nakajima Sake power plant. The Hellcat's mighty engine now hurled the 6-ton airframe upwards at a staggering 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui, struggling to follow in his lightweight Zero, felt his aircraft's airspeed rapidly bleed away as its less powerful engine strained against gravity. The tables had turned in an unexpected twist. At an altitude of 15,000 feet, the Hellcat pilot executed a maneuver that defied the plane's weight class, a graceful, deadly pirouette that reversed direction and placed the American fighter directly above Fukaleli, descending onto his tail like a hawk. Fukaleli's report conveyed his shock. 6 machine guns, not the anticipated 4, unleashed an unprecedented volume of fire. In a mere 3 seconds, 1,750 caliber rounds tore through the unarmored fuselage of his Zero. The deafening noise and jarring impacts assaulted his senses, but Fukaleli's instinctive decision to throw his plane into a desperate spin allowed him to escape the stream of tracers. He barely managed to nurse his riddled aircraft back to Marcus Island, while his wingman, Petty Officer Secondas Masao, never returned. The Hellcat's aerial prowess took the Japanese by surprise. Fukui's report sent tremors through the command, as the lumbering American planes defied expectations, demonstrating unexpected climbing ability. Just a week later, on October 5, the lesson was driven home with greater brutality over Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led a flight of 12 Zeros to intercept what they assumed was another minor American carrier raid. Climbing to 20,000 feet, they positioned themselves with every advantage, altitude, position, and surprise. "Below us, 12 F6F fighters," Shea wrote in his diary. Victory was certain. This would be a textbook engagement, a classic bounce from above. The Zeros dove. The Hellcat pilots displayed an unexpected response as the Zeros descended upon the unsuspecting Americans. Rather than panic or scatter, the Hellcat aviators maintained their formation, gently diving and accelerating. The Zeros, optimized for agility rather than high-speed dives, struggled to catch the heavier, more streamlined Hellcats. As the Japanese pilots opened fire from maximum range, hoping for lucky hits on the unarmored American planes, they witnessed their bullets sparking off the fuselages with minimal effect. The Hellcat's 212-pound armor cocoons around the pilots, coupled with self-sealing fuel tanks capable of absorbing numerous hits, rendered the Zero's firepower largely ineffective. The Zero, a plane vulnerable to a few well-placed rounds, now faced a veritable flying tank. The Hellcat's counterattack against the retreating Zeros unfolded not as a traditional dogfight, but as a physics lesson. Eschewing tight turning maneuvers, the American pilots leveraged their aircraft's immense engine power and weight as formidable weapons. They climbed rapidly, regaining altitude at a rate the Zeros simply could not match. At high altitudes, the Japanese fighters' engines gasped for air, their performance plummeting dramatically. Shea, a witness to the engagement, described the Hellcat's devastating tactics. "They came down on us like hawks on sparrows. Their weight gave them speed we couldn't match. They would dive, unleash their 6 fearsome guns, then climb away before we could react. It was a slaughter. The Hellcats refused to engage in the Zero's preferred turning duels, instead exploiting their technical superiority to devastating effect. The American pilots employed a tactical approach they termed boom and zoom, diving in, firing, then climbing rapidly. This clinical, efficient, and devastating maneuver proved overwhelmingly effective, with 8 Japanese Zeros shot down in minutes without a single Hellcat lost. The myth of the Zero's invincibility was shattered over Wake Island, as the American fighters, armed with rifles, outmatched the Japanese pilots' swords from a distant hilltop. The Hellcat was not designed to outmaneuver the Zero, but rather to make the Zero's vaunted agility irrelevant. The Americans had carefully analyzed the Zero's strengths and weaknesses, then engineered both an aircraft and a doctrine specifically tailored to neutralize the former and exploit the latter. This new American approach became known as energy fighting. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had laid bare the horrifying truth dawning across the Pacific. The Hellcat's superiority over the Zero was not a matter of dogfighting prowess, but of a fundamentally different strategic vision. In the evolving air war, fighter pilots embraced a philosophy that viewed their aircraft not as dueling rapiers, but as reservoirs of kinetic and potential energy. Speed represented kinetic energy, while altitude equated to potential energy. The objective was to maintain a higher energy state than one's adversary at all times. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch had developed a tactical maneuver, dubbed the Thatch Weave, where 2 friendly fighters would fly in a coordinated pattern that constantly covered each other's tails, luring enemy pilots into the guns of their partner. This tactic, combined with the Hellcat fighter's inherent strengths, created a deadly new system. Japanese pilots, trained as individual samurai warriors, now faced a ruthlessly coordinated machine. At Rabaul in November 1943, Lieutenant Commander Dao Tanemisu, a 32 Victory ace, sought to convey this new reality to his pilots. With a grim tone, he instructed them to forget everything they knew about air combat. The Americans, he emphasized, have changed the rules. They no longer fight our fight. The Hellcat's combat tactics differed starkly from the Japanese approach. As Tanemezu described, the American fighters operated in coordinated pairs, a leader and a wingman, one high and one low. While a Zero pilot desperately tried to turn against one Hellcat, the other was already diving in from above. Their radios, which had initially seemed like unnecessary weight, enabled flawless coordination. Whereas the Japanese flew as individual samurai, the Americans fought as a unified system. This systemic advantage extended far beyond the cockpit. While Japanese pilots scanned the vast sky with the naked eye, relying on instinct and chance, Hellcat pilots received radar-guided targeting from controllers aboard the carriers below. The Americans had mastered a secret weapon the Japanese could not comprehend. Japan had perfected the warrior, but America had perfected the system. The radar operators surveyed glowing screens, detecting Japanese formations from distances of 50, 70, or even 100 miles. They maneuvered their Hellcat fighters like chess masters preparing a decisive checkmate. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi recounted the harrowing experience. We were climbing through clouds when they struck without warning. No visual contact, Hellcats diving from above, precisely on our heading, perfectly positioned. They knew our altitude, our course. We were blind men fighting those with night vision. The technological gulf was widening into a chasm. The Hellcat's 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns unleashed a combined 4,500 rounds per minute. Each heavy, high-velocity slug carried 4 times the kinetic energy of the smaller 7.7 mm rounds fired by the Zero fighters. The Hellcat's devastating firepower proved decisive against the fragile, unarmored Zero. While the Japanese pilots were once the world's elite, their grueling 3-year training regimen could not keep pace with the Hellcat's onslaught. By early 1944, the relentless attrition had become catastrophic, as the elite cadre dwindled faster than they could be replaced. The Hellcat's heavy armament unleashed a torrent of lead that shredded the Zero's delicate frame. The American fighter was an aerial anvil, plummeting from above onto its Japanese counterpart, a glass cannon, in comparison. Yet the most pivotal factor may not have been the planes or tactics, but the pilots themselves. Japan had commenced the war with a small, supremely skilled corps, their training program legendary for its rigor and 700-hour requirement before combat. These aviators represented the best of the best. However, they constituted a finite resource, and the Hellcat was eliminating them at a rate the 3-year training pipeline could not sustain. By early 1944, this relentless attrition had reached catastrophic levels, the elite cadre's numbers dwindling beyond replacement. The Japanese naval aviation program rushed new pilots to the front lines with as little as 300 hours of flight time, later reduced to just 200 hours. Crippling fuel shortages meant most of this training occurred in gliders or outdated aircraft, with gunnery practice limited to a handful of rounds. These pilots entered combat against the world's most formidable fighter system with barely enough training to safely take off and land. In stark contrast, the American war effort operated on a vastly different scale. The United States had established a comprehensive, systematic pilot training program. American aviators arrived in the Pacific theater with a minimum of 300 flight hours, often more, including at least 50 hours specifically in the Hellcat fighter. They had fired thousands of practice rounds and honed their carrier landing skills until it became second nature. These pilots had also learned energy fighting tactics in the safe skies over Texas and Florida, rather than facing veteran aces in a life-or-death struggle. The tragic fate of Japan's young pilots was chronicled in a heartbreaking final report by Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, a training officer. Enon Yamamoto, a novice flyer, had arrived at the front just yesterday, never having fired his guns in the air or flown at night due to a lack of ammunition and fuel for practice. Tragically, he lasted a mere 7 minutes in his first combat engagement. The once vaunted samurai were gone, and now Japan was sending untrained peasants with swords to face a mechanized army. This confluence of factors, the Allies' superior aircraft, revolutionary tactics, radar technology, and overwhelming pilot skill gap, culminated in a single horrific day in June 1944, which would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese Navy, facing a desperate situation, committed its entire remaining carrier force to Operation Ago, a high-stakes plan to deliver a decisive blow against the American fleet in the Philippine Sea. They mustered 9 carriers and 4 5.0 aircraft, scraping together resources from across the empire. This would be their last stand. Opposing them was the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58, comprising 15 carriers and over 9 5.0 aircraft, including 450 F6F Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his attack in 4 waves, still clinging to the belief that the superior range of his aircraft and the Bushido spirit of his pilots would secure victory. However, the first wave of 69 Japanese aircraft was detected by American radar when they were still 150 miles away. The tactical chess match had begun. Shipboard fighter directors calmly vectored dozens of Hellcats to the optimal interception point, setting up the ambush flawlessly with a substantial altitude advantage. The sun's glare at their backs provided the Japanese Zero fighters with a tactical advantage as they approached. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the escort, spotted the American planes just minutes before the attack. A chill ran down his spine as he described the sight, a towering, terrifying steel curtain of dark blue fighters stacked in layers from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, poised and ready. Every advantage lay with the Americans. The ensuing engagement was not a fight, but an execution, lasting a mere 12 minutes. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft in the first wave, 42 were shot down. The Zeros attempted their signature turning dogfights, but the Hellcat pilots refused to oblige. "We'd make a high-side run, shoot one down, and zoom climb back to altitude," reported Commander David McCampbell, the top American Navy ace. The Zeros would try to follow, stall out, and another Hellcat would pick them off. The slaughter continued throughout the day. The Japanese air armada encountered a relentless onslaught. By day's end, 346 carrier-based aircraft had been lost, along with dozens more from land bases. In contrast, American casualties amounted to a mere 30 planes across all causes. That evening, pilots in the carrier-ready rooms joked that the engagement had resembled a turkey shoot back home, a descriptor that stuck. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Carrier Air Wing, a force that had terrorized the Pacific for over 2 years, had effectively ceased to exist in a single afternoon. The psychological toll on the surviving Japanese pilots was immense, leading to what military psychologists would later term Hellcat psychosis, a profound disconnection from the human dimension of combat. The advent of radar-guided fighter control had revolutionized aerial combat, rendering conventional tactics obsolete. As Admiral Ozawa acknowledged in his after-action report, the enemy's technological prowess had achieved the unthinkable, the industrialization of air warfare, where pilots now engaged not mere aircraft, but an all-encompassing system. This realization struck the Japanese forces with collective horror, shattering the confidence born of their earlier successes. Faced with an indestructible foe, Japan resorted to the ultimate act of desperation, the kamikaze. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, the architect of this tactic, justified it through cold, brutal logic. A conventional Zero fighter attack on a carrier held little chance of success, as the Hellcats would inevitably destroy it. However, by transforming the Zero into a guided bomb, the probability of a hit increased to 30%. The pilot's fate remained the same, death was certain either way. Yet, as Onishi argued, the kamikaze's self-sacrifice lent meaning to an otherwise futile end. The technological gulf that had opened between the combatants had rendered conventional tactics obsolete, driving Japan to embrace the ultimate form of asymmetric warfare. This shift in the nature of air combat marked a grim turning point in the Pacific conflict. The Hellcat's unparalleled dominance ultimately led to a tragic conclusion. The only viable countermeasure was to transform enemy pilots into guided missiles, hoping to breach the formidable aerial defenses. Yet even in this desperate gambit, the Hellcat proved its worth, shifting from hunter to guardian. During the 1945 Battle of Okinawa, Japan launched nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties. Hellcats flew tens of thousands of combat air patrols, forming a protective umbrella over the fleet. They became masters at shooting down these suicidal attackers, preventing an estimated 80% from ever reaching their targets. This grim final chapter saw the Hellcat standing as the last line of defense against an enemy that had been technologically and tactically outmatched. When the war concluded, the sheer scale of American industrial might became a terrifying revelation to the vanquished Japanese. The Grumman factory in Bethpage, New York, operated around the clock, 7 days a week. At its peak, a brand new F6F Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every hour. Grumman produced over 12,000 Hellcats in just 30 months. In 1944 alone, America manufactured 35,000 fighter aircraft of all types, while Japan managed to build just over 5,000 that year. Jiro Hiroshi, the designer of the Zero, studied a captured Hellcat after the war and concluded, "We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were building the industrial age." In his final interview before his death in 2000, Saburo Sakai, the legendary ace who had initially dismissed the Hellcat, acknowledged its profound impact, stating, "The Zero made Japan a great naval power." The Hellcat's emergence compelled Japan to confront the limits of its military prowess. The Japanese had long fancied themselves modern-day samurai, but this new American fighter exposed their forces as merely men wielding outdated weaponry against a technologically superior foe. Remarkably, many Japanese pilots survived the war only because Hellcat pilots chose to spare their lives, a humiliating reality that underscored their utter dependence on the mercy of their adversaries. The Japanese aviators had initially scoffed at the Hellcat, deriding its bulk, size, and aesthetics as clumsy and brutish. Yet they failed to recognize that the fighter's apparent heft embodied crucial advantages: a more powerful engine, protective armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy-duty radios, and an overall ruggedness reflecting the industrial might of the nation that produced it. The United States, with its vast industrial capacity, could afford to prioritize technology over manpower. The nation engineered not merely a superior fighter aircraft, but an entire military framework optimized for victory. As Japanese aviators' initial derision gave way to desperate suicide attacks, their once formidable air force had been decimated, their empire crumbling. The Grumman Hellcat, the apex predator of the skies, had the final say.